The Bible begins with these words: in the beginning, God created. These 5 brief words begin an epic movement that has not stopped to this day. These words start off an account of not only God's creation, but his interaction with his creation. In fact, as you read through Genesis chapter 1 and 2, you see this constant refrain that God says that his creation is good. In fact, upon creating mankind, Scripture tells us that he created them, male and female, in his likeness. To this, God says, this is very good. You see, this world was meant to be perfect. It was meant to be without flaw, without defect. But then you turn it over to Genesis chapter 3, and something happens. Sin enters this world. It comes through Satan in his attempt to usurp God's authority. Satan comes into this world and he tempts God's created, Adam and Eve, promising them knowledge great and vast. And once they give into this temptation, Scripture tells us that they become ashamed. It's interesting, though, ashamed is their first emotion. What's interesting is their first action. Because once they've sinned and now they're aware, the very first thing they do is they hide from God. It's interesting that as you go through the rest of the Old Testament, for centuries to come, you read account after account of the people of God hiding from God, the people of God rushing to other idols or deities, the people of God hiding their face from the glory of God, the people of God even trying to hide their sin in the atonement of sacrifice of animals. You see the people of God for centuries hiding from God until something changes everything. It's Jesus that breaks this cycle. As you start reading the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, as you get to the end of Jesus' account of his life on this earth, you see that it's this week that we're celebrating now, centuries ago, that Jesus put an end to the hiding. He purposely marched into Jerusalem that week. He boldly drove out tax collectors from the temple. He graciously performed miracles for those who still had needs. And he earnestly prayed to the Father, knowing what he was about to endure, not only just on the cross, but in the presence of God. Jesus said, Father, if it be your will, please take this cup from me. But yet not my will, but yours be done. Jesus absolutely knew what was going to happen when he stood in the presence of God, though he had no sin of his own, carrying our very sin with him. That's why he was not caught off guard when he was betrayed by one of his closest friends. That's why he knew the trial would be a sham. That's why he had the wherewithal to endure the pain of the cross, because he knew the worst was to come, the end of the hiding. That sin had to be accounted for, that God had to remove what Satan had put in here that was never meant to be, that what was created to be good could be made good again. And so Jesus took that to God. And here's the thing, Jesus could have hid. He could have ran, he could have went the other way, but he didn't. He made his entry triumphal. Jesus could have cowered, but he didn't. That final week, he preached as one with authority. And Jesus could have, on that cross, still held rage against you and I, but instead he prayed to the Father, Father, have compassion on them, forgive them, for they know not what they do. You see, Jesus completed on that cross what Satan tried to usurp so many years ago. But what's interesting was before the cross, there was a conversation.
That conversation is recorded in Matthew 27. It was between a guy by the name of Pilate, who was the Roman on the spot. He was the Roman in charge, and between him and a crowd of Israelites, many more in Jerusalem that day than normal, because they were going through the holiday of the Passover. And so very many folks, Israelites, were there. This is how it's recorded in verse 17, chapter 27 in Matthew. It says, "So when the crowd had gathered, Pilate asked them, 'Which one do you want me to release to you?'" You see, Pilate had a tradition that every year during the Passover, he would release an Israelite prisoner. It was a way to appease the people, to make them happy. He says, "Which one of you do you want me to release to you, Barabbas or Jesus, who is called Christ?" Pilate refers to Jesus in an unusual way here. "Do you want me to release to you Barabbas or Jesus, who is called the Christ?" It's as if Pilate is distinguishing Jesus from some other Jesus. kind of distinguishing between the two. And in fact, that is probably what's going on there. According to many of the ancient manuscripts, Barabbas's first name, his given name, is actually Yeshua, Jesus. It was actually a pretty common name back then. But the gospel writers probably didn't include his first name, Barabbas's first name, for two reasons. One, because Barabbas was a bad guy, and they didn't want Jesus' name associated with a bad guy. And number two, because Jesus was the Lord, high and lifted up. And they sort of wanted to reserve that name for just Jesus. So probably the way it would have sounded was Pilate coming out to say, do you want me to release to you Jesus Barabbas or Jesus who's called the Christ? Verse 20 goes on. The chief priests and the elders persuaded the crowd to ask for Barabbas and to have Jesus executed. Which of the two of you do you want me to release to you? Asked the governor. Barabbas, they answered. Well, what shall I do then with Jesus who is called the Christ? Pilate asked. And they all answered, crucify him. Now, Barabbas would have been imprisoned in a place called the Fortress of Antonia. That's where all the prisoners in Jerusalem would have been held. Jesus was standing before Pilate, which means he would have been in a place called the Pavement. This is an elevated rock stone area that was right outside of Pilate's palace, or where he would have stayed. The question is, how far were these two Jesuses from each other? The Fortress of Antonia, where Barabbas is being imprisoned, is about 2,000 feet away from the Pavement, the elevated stone area where Jesus the Christ would have been. That's 2,000 feet. That's a little less than half a mile. What that means is that Barabbas would probably be able to hear a crowd of people yelling, but was too far away to hear just one person asking the questions. In other words, he probably could not have heard Pilate asking the crowd questions, but he probably could have heard the crowd answering those questions back. So, what must Barabbas have heard? Now, this is what we're going to do. If you'll humor me here, I'm going to play the part of Pilate, okay? And if you could play the part of a murderous crowd mob, that would be great, okay? So I'm going to ask the questions. Your lines are Barabbas, Barabbas, okay? Who do you want me to release to you? Barabbas, Barabbas. And then I'm going to ask you, well, then what do you want me to do with Jesus? And you're going to say, crucify him, okay? Are you ready? All right. Who do you want me to release to you? Barabbas, Barabbas. That's good. Now think pitchforks and torches, okay? Murderous mob. Barabbas, Barabbas. Well, then what do you want me to do with Jesus? Crucify him. So 2,000 feet away, Barabbas in his jail cell would have heard, Barabbas, Barabbas, crucify him, crucify him. Can you imagine how freaked out Barabbas would have been? In his jail cell, what he would have been thinking and feeling as those Roman guards were approaching his jail cell, as he heard them stick the key into the lock and jiggle it and open it up. He must have thought, this is it. This is the end for me. How surprised he must have been then for them to come in and say, you're free to go. I'm just imagining the confused look on his face to the point that the soldiers had to explain what was going on. Oh, no, you're free to go. Jesus the Christ is going to be crucified on your cross. Now, Barabbas was guilty. There's no question about that. The gospel writers make it clear. Matthew calls him a thief. Luke calls him a murderer. Barabbas did nothing to earn this pardon. As far as we know, he didn't say he was sorry. There was no rehabilitation. There was no promise of life change. There was no real guarantee that his future behavior was going to be any different than his past behavior. He did nothing to receive this gift of life. And yet Jesus dies on his cross. Does that sound familiar? I mean, it should, because in a sense, that's what Easter is all about. Out of all the characters in all the Easter pageants, in all the churches, in all the countries around the world, Barabbas is probably the character that we know the least about. and yet he's probably the character that we most relate to. Certainly, if I were going to play a character in the Easter pageant, this guilty man who Jesus takes his place on the cross, that's the guy I can relate to. I sinned. I've blown it. I've messed up. Now, I am guilty of that thing that Brad was talking about in the video, that idea that Adam and Eve brought sin into the world and that, really we sort of confirmed their decision. I've jumped in with them, and Romans 3:23 says that you have as well. Romans 3:23 says that all have sinned and fallen short of God's glorious ideals. If you're new to church and sin sounds like it's just a churchy word, that second half of that verse explains it. For all have sinned and fallen short of God's glorious ideals. Now, what is sin? It's falling short of God's idea for you. God had an idea about who you were going to be. He had an ideal for you. And for most of us, we don't live up to God's ideals. We don't live up to our ideals for ourselves. Just to be honest, probably you look at yourself in the mirror every once in a while and go, man, I'm just not the husband that I want to be. Or you may be journaling some night and say, you know what, I'm just not the mom that I want to be. Or you may think to yourself as you try to take care of your aging parents, you know what, I'm just not the kind of child to my parents as I wanted to be. You might look at your neighbors and say, you know what, I never have time for them. I don't serve them the way they serve me. Man, I'm just not the neighbor that I want to be. And we're pretty far away from New Year's, but think about your New Year's resolutions and the standards that you set for yourself, the things you were going to accomplish. Could you look in the mirror and go, yep, tick them all off? Or would you say that there are times in your life when you say, you know what, I don't reach the standards that I set for myself? And guys, we all have an innate sense that God's standards for us are probably a little higher than the standards that we set for ourselves. Romans 3:23, for all have sinned and fallen short of God's glorious ideals for us. And so what then does that mean? Brad talked about it a little bit. Romans 6:23 says that the wages, and we know what wages are, that's what we earn. That's I do this is what I've earned. It says the wages of sin is death. That basically, just like Barabbas, we're kind of like on death row because of our sin. Man, what do you do with that? I asked in the first service how many people had flown out of LaGuardia Airport. I got like 2 people. So let me ask you this. How many of you have ever heard of LaGuardia Airport? Okay, thank you. Much more participation now. So LaGuardia Airport is named after a famous mayor of New York City, Fiorello LaGuardia. He was a mayor a long time ago. And one of the things he did when governing is that one of the ways he kept his finger on the pulse of his city was when certain officials, heads of departments were out sick or on vacation, Fiorello would fill in and do their job. And therefore kind of, keep track of what's going on in the city. Well, one night there was a vacancy at night court and they needed somebody to preside over night court. And Fiorello came and presided over night court. It was a very cold evening, and they brought in a man who's accused of stealing bread, and that man was trembling. The story goes he's probably trembling because it was cold outside, but also because he was scared because he knew he was guilty. He admitted to it. He told everybody in the courtroom the story about how his children were starving, his family was hungry. And so reluctantly, feeling like he had no other choice, he stole bread from one of his neighbors. He was guilty. Everybody in the courtroom wanted to say, well, that's okay, it's all right. But LaGuardia was faced with this incredible dilemma. He can't just dismiss the law. He can't ignore the fact of the guilt and just let the man go free. To do that would undermine the law for everybody else. It would send the message that, hey, obey the law, don't obey the law. It's really not that big a deal. LaGuardia had to lay down the punishment. But if he punishes the guy, he's thinking to himself, my goodness, I mean, this man was so poor, he had to go steal bread. I can't have him pay a fine. That makes him more poor than he was in the first place. And if he can't pay the fine, I got to put him in jail, which is going to put his family in a worse situation that they were in before the offense. And so this is what happened. It's a true story. LaGuardia said, I have to punish you. There can be no exceptions to the law. Therefore, I will fine you, which back then this was a sizable fine. I will fine you $10. But as he said those words, he was also standing up and reaching into his own back pocket. And he pulled out his wallet and he paid the fine himself out of his own money. You see, I think God is faced with a similar dilemma, except on a universal scale. Here we are, all facing a fine that we cannot afford to pay, a death sentence. And God can't ignore the law. He can't say, well, it just doesn't matter, and sweep these things under the rug. It would violate his own nature as a holy God. And so what is he to do? Indeed, what has he done? The Bible tells us, for God so loved the world that he got up and reached into his own back pocket. For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son. And whoever believes in him will not perish, but have everlasting life. I don't know what brought you here today. Maybe it's something from your past that you just can't shake, some failure or abuse or some rejection in your past. Maybe it's something in your present, some illness that you're facing, some financial issue that you just can't seem to get out from under, some habit that you just can't seem to kick, or some issue with your kids that's breaking your heart. And maybe you're asking questions about your future. You got questions about the future of your career. You're slamming up against a glass ceiling, and you're not quite sure what the future holds. Maybe you're asking questions about the future of your marriage, or just the future of your life. You question, man, what's my purpose? There's got to be more to life than this. See, more often than not, people come through those doors and they feel a lot like Barabbas in that jail cell, shackled to something, frustrated by something, hopeless when faced with that thing. And maybe you feel like Barabbas to the point you would say, man, I feel like the death sentence has already been pronounced on my life. My career is as good as dead. Our company's getting bought out. There's probably not a future for me. Or my future is hopeless. I'm as good as dead. Maybe you hate to admit it, but the love that used to thrive in your family, you would say, you know what? It just kind of feels just dead. Listen, I just want to say, you being here tonight is no accident. And if you came tonight because, hey, you know what, you're into empty religious rituals and, you know, it's Easter, so it's a nice thing to show up. Or maybe for you, it's just, you know, it's a tradition and somebody kind of guilted you into it. Like, hey, it's a tradition. And so you come to church on Easter and you hear some nice words and you hear some nice music and you walk away feeling nice. Or maybe you're here today because you just, man, you know what? You just want to be nice to mom. And this is a nice thing to do before we all go out and eat, you know, ham in the Easter dinner together. I don't think that's it. See, here's what I think. God brought you here today to remind you or to tell you for the very first time that he sent Jesus down to die on your cross. And whatever is dead in your life, it doesn't have to stay dead.